It seems like this.
In the winter of 1996, Sheriff Robert Hadley of Pine County, Minnesota, received a call that would haunt him for the rest of his career. A state trooper had discovered an abandoned vehicle on a remote stretch of County Road 7, about 15 miles from the nearest town. The car's engine was still warm, but there was no sign of the driver. What seemed like a routine case of a stranded motorist quickly evolved into one of the most disturbing investigations in the county's history. The vehicle belonged to 23-year-old Karen Matheson, a graduate student at the University of Minnesota who had been driving home to visit her parents for the holidays. Her luggage was still in the trunk, and her purse remained on the passenger seat with her wallet intact. The only signs of disturbance were the driver's side door left ajar and footprints in the fresh snow leading from the car into the dense pine forest that bordered the road. Sheriff Hadley immediately organized a search party. As an experienced law enforcement officer with 15 years under his belt, he had handled missing persons cases before, but something about this one sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the below-freezing temperatures. The footprints showed no signs of struggle or panic. They were evenly spaced, as if Karen had calmly walked into the woods of her own accord. The search continued through the night with no results. By morning, a storm had moved in, covering any remaining tracks with fresh powder. Days passed, then weeks. Karen's family plastered the county with missing person posters. Sheriff Hadley interviewed everyone who might have seen her on that stretch of road, but leads were sparse. The case grew cold, much like the Minnesota winter that had swallowed Karen Matheson. 3 months later, as the spring thaw began, a hiker discovered human remains in a small clearing about 2 miles from where Karen's car had been found. Sheriff Hadley arrived at the scene to find a body that had been partially preserved by the winter cold. It was Karen, wearing the same clothes described in her missing person report, lying on her back with her arms crossed over her chest. The medical examiner later determined that she had died from exposure, but could not explain how she had ended up so deep in the woods, or why her body had been positioned in such a deliberate manner. What troubled Sheriff Hadley most was what the medical examiner found in Karen's coat pocket: a small piece of paper with his badge number written on it, a badge number he had only received 2 weeks before Karen's disappearance. No one outside the department should have known that number. The investigation took an even darker turn when Sheriff Hadley reviewed records of similar cases in neighboring counties. Over the past decade, 3 other young women had disappeared under nearly identical circumstances, all found in wooded areas, all positioned the same way, all with pieces of paper bearing numbers that corresponded to local law enforcement identification. None of the cases had been connected before because they had occurred in different jurisdictions and years apart. Sheriff Hadley became obsessed with finding the connection. He spent countless nights poring over case files, interviewing witnesses again, and searching for any common thread. His marriage suffered, his health declined, but he couldn't let go of the case. The idea that someone was targeting these women and somehow connecting their deaths to local law enforcement consumed him. The breakthrough came nearly a year later. Sheriff Hadley discovered that all 4 women had attended the same rural high school, though in different years. When he visited the school, he learned that they had all been taught by the same history teacher, William Mercer, who had retired 5 years earlier after teaching for over 3 decades. When Sheriff Hadley went to interview Mercer at his isolated farmhouse, he found the front door unlocked and the house empty. In the basement, he discovered a room wallpapered with newspaper clippings about missing persons cases spanning decades, many more than the 4 he had connected. On a desk, sat a neatly organized ledger with names, dates, and numbers, including badge numbers of various law enforcement officers. The investigation that followed revealed that Mercer had been systematically abducting former students after carefully studying the jurisdictional boundaries and shifts of local law enforcement. He would leave each victim in a location where he knew a specific officer would be called to investigate. The badge numbers were his way of taking credit for his crimes while taunting authorities. What made the case particularly disturbing was Mercer's methodology. He didn't physically force his victims into the woods. He used his knowledge of psychology and his former authority as their teacher to manipulate them. Forensic psychologists later theorized that he was able to use a form of coercive control to make his victims walk willingly to their deaths, perhaps convincing them they were participating in some kind of important experiment or spiritual journey. Despite an extensive multi-state manhunt, William Mercer was never found. Some believe he fled to Canada. Others think he may have taken his own life in one of the countless remote areas he knew so well. The unsolved nature of his disappearance left Sheriff Hadley and the victims' families without closure. For years afterward, Sheriff Hadley would receive anonymous postcards on the anniversary of Karen Matheson's disappearance. The postcards never contained any text, just new badge numbers. Each time, Hadley would investigate and discover that the number belonged to a law enforcement officer who had recently been assigned to a rural area. Each time, he would warn them to be vigilant. So far, no new victims matching Mercer's pattern have been found. Sheriff Hadley retired in 2008, but he never stopped looking over his shoulder. In a rare interview given to a true crime podcast in 2015, he admitted that the case had fundamentally changed him. "There's evil in this world that doesn't announce itself," he said. "It walks among us wearing a friendly face, teaching our children, knowing our routines. The scariest predators aren't the ones who look dangerous. They're the ones who understand exactly how to use our trust against us." The case has become legendary among law enforcement in the upper Midwest, a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities that exist, even in tight-knit rural communities. New officers are trained to be wary of cases involving precisely arranged bodies and victims who show no signs of resistance. They're taught to recognize the patterns that Sheriff Hadley identified too late. To this day, whenever a car is found abandoned on a remote road in Minnesota during winter, with footprints leading into the woods, officers approach with particular dread. They call it walking the Mercer line, the thin boundary between civilization and wilderness, where a calculating predator once operated with impunity, using the badge numbers of the very people sworn to protect his victims as trophies in his twisted game. For the families of the identified victims, the lack of resolution remains an open wound. For law enforcement in the region, the possibility that William Mercer, or someone inspired by him, might still be out there serves as a grim reminder that some evil cannot be easily contained or understood. And for those who travel the back roads of Pine County on cold winter nights, the story of Sheriff Hadley and the teacher who got away is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who know exactly how the system works and how to exploit it. In the summer of 2002, Sheriff Dan Merritt of Adams County, Illinois, was known throughout the region for his methodical approach to law enforcement. A 20-year veteran of the department, Merritt had seen his fair share of rural crime, mostly petty theft, domestic disputes, and the occasional drug bust. Nothing in his career had prepared him for the case that would become known locally as the Harvest Moon Murders. It began on a sweltering August evening when a frantic 911 call came in from a farmhand who who had discovered something disturbing while working late in one of the vast cornfields that dominated the county landscape. Sheriff Merritt arrived at the Keller farm just as dusk was settling, the fading light casting long shadows across rows of corn standing 7 feet tall. "I've never seen anything like it, Sheriff," said the farmhand, a man in his 50s named Roy Gaines, his hands still trembling as he led Merritt into the field. "Been working these fields for 30 years, and I've never..." What Merritt found was a perfectly circular clearing in the middle of the cornfield, about 20 feet in diameter. The corn stalks hadn't been cut or broken. They had been meticulously bent to the ground in a spiral pattern, creating what looked like a flattened vortex. At the center lay the body of a young woman, carefully positioned with her arms at her sides, dressed in clean clothes that seemed out of place for someone found dead in a cornfield. There were no signs of a struggle, no obvious cause of death. Most disturbing was the fact that there were no footprints or disturbed soil leading to or from the clearing. It was as if the woman, and whoever had placed her there, had materialized out of thin air. The victim was identified as Ellie Thornton, a 26-year-old waitress from a neighboring county who had been reported missing 3 days earlier. The autopsy revealed something that sent a chill through the entire department. Ellie had died from dehydration. She had been alive in that clearing, unable or unwilling to leave, until her body simply gave out. Toxicology showed no evidence of drugs that might have incapacitated her. There were, however, unusual marks on her ankles, not bruises from restraints, but perfect circular impressions, as if something had been carefully wrapped around them and then removed. As Sheriff Merritt dug deeper into the investigation, he discovered something troubling. 7 years earlier, a similar case had occurred 1 county over. A young man had been found dead in a cornfield clearing with identical marks on his ankles. The case had never been solved and had eventually been attributed to some kind of cult activity. The file had been buried and forgotten until Merritt's inquiry brought it back to light. 2 weeks after Ellie's body was discovered, it happened again. Another clearing, another body positioned in the same way. This time, a 31-year-old male teacher from the local high school. Same cause of death, same mysterious ankle markings, same absence of tracks leading to or from the scene. Panic began to spread through Adams County. Farmers started patrolling their fields at night, armed with shotguns. Parents kept their children indoors. The media descended on the small community, turning the case into national news and dubbing the unknown perpetrator the Cornfield Killer. Sheriff Merritt found himself under enormous pressure to solve the case quickly. He called in state investigators and even consulted with FBI profilers, but the evidence remained frustratingly sparse. The only concrete lead was the ankle markings, which forensic experts eventually determined were consistent with a specific type of medical restraint used in some psychiatric facilities: soft but extremely strong fabric straps with a unique weave pattern. Following this thread, Merritt discovered that both victims had briefly been patients at Riverside Psychiatric Center, a facility about 40 miles from Adams County that had closed down 5 years earlier due to budget cuts. When he tracked down records from the facility, he found that the victim from 7 years ago had also been a patient there. As Merritt dug into the patient records from Riverside, he uncovered a disturbing pattern. All 3 victims had been treated by the same psychiatrist, Dr. Leonard Hoffman, and all had been part of a research study focused on treating anxiety through environmental immersion therapy. The records were vague about what this therapy entailed, but notes indicated it involved exposing patients to open spaces while in a controlled mental state. When Merritt attempted to locate Dr. Hoffman, he learned that the psychiatrist had supposedly died in a house fire shortly after Riverside closed. The body had been burned beyond recognition and identified through dental records. But something didn't add up. The timing seemed too convenient, and the more Merritt investigated Hoffman's background, the more inconsistencies he found. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. An elderly nurse who had worked at Riverside contacted Merritt after seeing news coverage of the murders. She explained that Dr. Hoffman had been conducting unauthorized experiments, combining hypnotherapy with experimental drugs. His theory was that he could reprogram patients with severe anxiety to find comfort in open spaces rather than fear them. But something had gone terribly wrong with the treatment. Some patients developed what he called environmental anchoring, the nurse explained. Once placed in certain settings while under his influence, they became psychologically unable to leave that space, even if it meant their own death. The hospital administration was investigating him when the facility closed down. Armed with this information, Sheriff Merritt began a manhunt for Dr. Hoffman, convinced that the psychiatrist had faked his death. The search led him to an isolated farmhouse purchased under a false name 6 years earlier. The property sat at the junction of 3 counties, a strategic location that had allowed Hoffman to work across jurisdictional boundaries, complicating any potential investigation. When Merritt and his deputies surrounded the farmhouse, they found it empty, but clearly recently occupied. In the basement, they discovered a makeshift psychiatric office with patient files, medical restraints matching the ankle markings, and detailed maps of cornfields throughout the region. On the walls were photographs of dozens of people. Some were the known victims, but many others were faces Merritt didn't recognize. Most chilling was a journal in which Hoffman had meticulously documented his field studies. The psychiatrist had continued his research independently, abducting former patients and others who fit his criteria, using a combination of drugs and hypnosis to implant what he called boundary anchors in their minds. He would then place them in the carefully prepared cornfield clearings, remove their restraints, and observe from a distance as they remained trapped by invisible psychological walls until death took them. From hidden cameras Hoffman had placed near the clearings, Merritt recovered footage that was almost too disturbing to watch. It showed victims awake and alert, clearly distressed, but unable to step beyond the boundary of the flattened corn, as if an impenetrable barrier existed in their minds. The footage showed Hoffman occasionally entering the clearing to take notes and speak to his victims, calmly explaining that they were helping advance the understanding of human psychology. A statewide alert went out for Hoffman's arrest, but the psychiatrist had vanished. The case took an even darker turn when investigators began excavating the property around the farmhouse. They ultimately uncovered the remains of 11 more victims buried beneath a garden, all with the same ankle markings, all former patients. 3 months into the investigation, with Hoffman still at large, Sheriff Merritt began experiencing intense headaches and memory lapses. During a routine physical, his doctor discovered unusual needle marks on the back of his neck. Toxicology tests revealed traces of the same experimental compounds found in Hoffman's lab. Somehow, Hoffman had managed to drug Merritt, likely while the sheriff was investigating the farmhouse. The realization sent a wave of panic through the department. If Hoffman could get to the sheriff, no one was safe. Merritt checked himself into a secure medical facility where doctors worked to counteract whatever had been done to him. During treatment, he began to recall brief interactions with Hoffman that his conscious mind had been programmed to forget, including a chilling message. "You'll never find me, Sheriff, because you've been looking right past me all along." Working with psychologists, Merritt recovered more of his manipulated memories and realized the horrifying truth. Hoffman had never intended to flee. Instead, He had implemented a contingency plan that involved hiding in plain sight by assuming a new identity as a first responder who would have legitimate access to crime scenes. This revelation led to the identification and arrest of a paramedic who had joined the county emergency services just after Riverside closed. Fingerprint and DNA analysis confirmed it was Hoffman, surgically altered and living under a stolen identity. He had been present at each crime scene, observing the investigation of his own handiwork from within the law enforcement perimeter. Hoffman was eventually tried and convicted of 14 counts of murder. He died in prison 3 years later, taking many of his secrets with him. Experts who studied his case believe there may be more victims who were never found, particularly in cornfields that have since been harvested or developed. For Sheriff Merritt, the case never truly ended. The effects of Hoffman's drugs left him with chronic migraines and occasional dissociative episodes. He remained sheriff for 2 more years before retiring on medical grounds. In his final statement to the press, Merritt offered a warning that would become famous in law enforcement circles throughout the Midwest. The most dangerous predators aren't the ones who attack from the shadows. They're the ones who reshape your reality so completely that you can't even see the cage they've built around you. Today, farmers in Adams County still report unusual clearings in their cornfields from time to time. Though investigations have never found evidence of new crimes, many locals refuse to enter the corn alone, especially as harvest season approaches and the fields grow tall. And on still summer nights, when the corn stalks rustle in the breeze, some swear they can hear whispers among the rows, reminders of a time when death walked their fields wearing a healer's face. Sheriff Ellen Mateo had served Blackwater County, Oregon, for nearly 16 years. The rural jurisdiction stretched across dense forests and winding mountain roads, with small communities scattered like pebbles across a vast wilderness. Most days brought routine calls, traffic accidents, petty theft, occasional domestic disputes. But in December of 2011, a series of disappearances began that would test the limits of her training and resolve. It started with Marcus Fuller, a 42-year-old park ranger who failed to return from a routine patrol along the Eastern Ridge Trail. His truck was found at the trailhead, equipment still inside, his lunch half-eaten on the passenger seat. The search lasted 6 days before Fuller's body was discovered in a shallow cave 2 miles from any marked trail. The medical examiner determined he had died from exposure after sustaining a broken ankle. But one detail troubled Sheriff Mateo. Fuller was an experienced outdoorsman who knew the area intimately, yet somehow he had wandered far from his usual route into terrain he rarely patrolled. 2 weeks later, Lisa Donovan, a 35-year-old local photographer, went missing while scouting locations for a winter landscape shoot. Her camera equipment was found neatly arranged on a rock overlooking Blackwater Gorge, as if she had set up for a photo and then simply walked away. 4 days into the search, rescuers found her body at the bottom of an unused logging road, nearly 7 miles from where she had left her equipment. Like Fuller, she had died from exposure, with no signs of foul play. People don't just wander off to die, Sheriff Mateo told her deputies during a briefing. Not experienced people who know these woods. When Calvin Weber, a 51-year-old hunting guide, became the 3rd person to disappear within a month, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Weber's clients reported that he had excused himself during their lunch break, walking into the trees to check some tracks. He never returned. His body was found 5 days later in a dry creek bed, miles from his last known location. The national media picked up the story, dubbing it the Blackwater Wilderness Deaths. Theories ranged from contaminated water sources causing disorientation to atmospheric anomalies affecting compass readings. The FBI sent a pair of agents to assist, but their investigation yielded little. The victims had nothing in common beyond their familiarity with the wilderness. Toxicology reports showed no evidence of drugs or poison. There were no common acquaintances, no shared activities beyond their love of the outdoors. Sheriff Mateo felt the pressure mounting as winter deepened and tourism, the lifeblood of many local businesses, began to dry up. People were afraid to venture into the woods, and locals whispered about curses and predators. She needed answers, not theories. The turning point came when Travis Henley, a 28-year-old Forest Service employee, went missing during a routine inspection of trail markers. The search began immediately, with Sheriff Mateo personally coordinating from a command post near the trailhead. On the second day, one of her deputies made a disturbing discovery. A small, almost invisible fishing line stretched across the trail at ankle height, with a tiny electronic device attached to a nearby tree. Further investigation revealed similar setups at multiple locations throughout the forest. The devices turned out to be modified wildlife cameras with small speakers attached. Digital forensics recovered partial recordings that included sounds of human footsteps, distant voices calling for help, and the subtle rustling of movement through underbrush. Someone's luring them off the trails, Sheriff Mateo realized, playing sounds that would make an experienced woodsman investigate. The discovery shifted the investigation from mysterious accidents to calculated murder. Sheriff Mateo ordered an intensive search of areas around where the devices had been found, leading to the recovery of Travis Henley, alive but severely hypothermic in a ravine. Unlike the others, he had managed to find shelter before succumbing to the elements. After recovering in the hospital, Henley confirmed the sheriff's theory. He had heard what sounded like a child crying for help off-trail and had gone to investigate, triggering another recording that led him further into the wilderness. The sounds always remained just out of sight, drawing him deeper until he became completely disoriented. It was like following a ghost, Henley told Sheriff Mateo from his hospital bed. The voice kept moving, always just around the next bend or over the next ridge. Armed with this information, Sheriff Mateo expanded the search for the deadly devices. Her team recovered 17 more setups throughout the forest, each strategically placed near trails frequently used by experienced hikers and forest workers, people who would feel confident enough to leave marked paths if they thought someone needed help. The technology wasn't sophisticated, but it was cleverly deployed. Motion sensors triggered recordings that would play through small weatherproof speakers, creating the illusion of someone moving through the woods. Once a target began following the sounds, secondary devices would activate, leading them further away from established trails into increasingly difficult terrain. Forensic analysis of the devices provided the first real lead. Several components had been purchased from the same online retailer and shipped to a P.O. box in neighboring Grant County. Security footage from the post office showed a man in his 60s retrieving packages, his face partially obscured by a fishing hat and sunglasses. Sheriff Mateo circulated the grainy image throughout local law enforcement channels. 3 days later, a deputy from Grant County recognized the man as Edward Carver, a former search and rescue coordinator who had been forced into retirement 5 years earlier after a controversial failed operation left 2 hikers dead. When Sheriff Mateo and her team arrived at Carver's remote cabin, they found a workshop filled with modified electronics, maps of Blackwater County with marked locations corresponding to where the devices had been found, and a journal detailing his meticulous plans. The cabin was empty, but Carver's vehicle was still in the driveway. A search of the surrounding area led them to a small hunting blind overlooking the cabin. Inside, they found Carver's body with a self-inflicted gunshot wound and a typed note that sent chills through Sheriff Mateo's department. They said I was incompetent, the note read, that I didn't understand the forest or how people behave when they're lost. I've proven them wrong. Even the most experienced outdoorsmen make predictable choices when they think someone needs help. They follow sounds without marking their path. They rush and make mistakes. They die, just like the Jensen couple died on my watch. No one questioned their expertise or judgment, only mine. The note continued, detailing how Carver had spent years perfecting his system, testing it first on animals before moving on to human targets. He had selected victims who, like the search and rescue volunteers who had criticized him, prided themselves on their wilderness knowledge. His goal had never been just to kill, but to engineer deaths that would appear accidental, the result of poor judgment by those who should have known better. Most disturbing was the final paragraph. By the time you read this, 6 more systems will have activated across 3 counties. Some are already leading their targets astray. You won't find them all in time. Sheriff Mateo immediately coordinated with neighboring jurisdictions to expand the search for Carver's devices. Over the next week, they located 4 of the 6 final systems, but confirmation came too late for Hunter Rollins, a backcountry guide in Jefferson County, who was found dead 30 miles from his last known location. The 6th device was never found, though searches continued for months. The case shook Sheriff Mateo's confidence in ways that would haunt her career. The woods she had patrolled for years had been weaponized against the very people who knew them best, exploiting their compassion and turning their expertise into a liability. For months afterward, hikers reported hearing phantom footsteps and distant calls for help, though no more devices were ever found. The following spring, Sheriff Mateo organized comprehensive training for all outdoor professionals in the region, focusing on new protocols for investigating potential distress calls. Trail markers were enhanced, GPS tracking systems implemented for rangers and guides, and buddy systems strictly enforced for anyone working in remote areas. What made Carver's method so effective was its simplicity, Sheriff Mateo explained during a law enforcement conference where she presented the case. He understood human nature, that experienced people often become the most vulnerable because they trust their instincts and abilities. He didn't need elaborate traps or direct violence. He just planted a seed, a sound that compelled action, and let the wilderness do the rest. The case became a standard training example for rural law enforcement across the Pacific Northwest. Experts in wilderness safety developed new guidelines addressing what became known as audio luring, and technology companies created apps that could help distinguish between real and recorded distress calls. For those who lived and worked around Blackwater County, the forest never felt quite the same. Even with Carver gone, his methodology had exposed a vulnerability in human nature that couldn't be easily dismissed. Every unexpected sound in the woods now carried a shadow of doubt. Sheriff Mateo continued serving her community for another 7 years before retiring. In her final interview with the local paper, she reflected on the case that defined the latter part of her career. What frightened me most wasn't Carver's devices, or even his calculated planning. It was the realization that our best instincts, the drive to help others in distress, could be turned against us so effectively. He didn't have to chase his victims through the woods. He made them chase ghosts until they couldn't find their way home. Today, hikers in the forests of Blackwater County sometimes report hearing strange, distant sounds that seem to follow no logical path through the trees. Rangers investigate each report thoroughly, but they also remind visitors of the cardinal rule instituted after the Carver case. No matter how urgent a distress call seems, always mark your starting position, alert authorities to your location, and never follow a sound you cannot see the source of. For Sheriff Mateo, Now living quietly in a small coastal town, the lesson of Edward Carver remains painfully clear. The most dangerous predator isn't the one that attacks directly. It's the one that manipulates its prey into fatal mistakes, using their own knowledge and compassion as weapons against them. And sometimes, the echo of footsteps you hear in the wilderness is designed to ensure you never find your way back to civilization. Sheriff Nadine Colson had seen her share of disturbing cases during her 12 years with the Elderwood County Sheriff's Department in eastern Kentucky. The opioid crisis had hit the rural community hard, bringing with it the usual parade of overdoses, thefts, and domestic violence calls. But nothing in her experience prepared her for what began on a rainy Tuesday in April 2014 with a seemingly routine welfare check. The call came from a postal worker who reported that mail had been piling up for nearly 2 weeks at a farmhouse on Old Mill Road. The property belonged to the Harmon family, an elderly couple in their 70s who rarely missed collecting their mail. Sheriff Colson decided to handle the call personally. The Harmons had been fixtures in the community for decades, and she'd known them since childhood. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, partially hidden by overgrown trees that had gone untrimmed for what looked like years. As Sheriff Colson pulled up to the house, she immediately noticed the eerie stillness. No smoke rose from the chimney, despite the spring chill. The family truck sat in the driveway, collecting leaves and pollen. The front porch light was on, though it was mid-afternoon. Sheriff Colson knocked on the door and announced herself. When no one answered, she peered through the windows, seeing nothing out of place, but no sign of movement either. Using the spare key that the Harmons had given to local law enforcement years ago, common practice in rural communities where neighbors looked out for each other, she entered the home. The interior was immaculate, almost unnaturally so. No dirty dishes in the sink, no newspapers on the coffee table, no signs of daily life interrupted. The thermostat was set at a steady 68 degrees. A pot of African violets on the windowsill looked freshly watered. "Mr. and Mrs. Harmon?" Sheriff Colson called out, her voice echoing in the quiet house. "It's Sheriff Colson, just checking to make sure everything's all right." She checked the bedrooms, finding both beds made with hospital corners, not a wrinkle in sight. The bathroom towels hung perfectly aligned on their racks. The medicine cabinet contained neatly arranged prescriptions for both Harmons, heart medication for him, arthritis pills for her, with none past their refill dates. It wasn't until Sheriff Colson descended into the basement that the picturesque farmhouse revealed its secret. The concrete floor had been recently bleached, but under the harsh beam of her flashlight, faint brownish stains were visible in the porous surface. A drain in the center of the floor showed similar discoloration. Most disturbing was the faint, sweet-sour smell that experienced law enforcement officers immediately recognize. The lingering odor of decomposition that no amount of cleaning can fully eliminate. Sheriff Colson called for backup and secured the scene. Within hours, the basement was filled with crime scene technicians who confirmed her suspicions. Blood had been cleaned from the floor, walls, and even the ceiling. Luminol testing revealed extensive spatter patterns consistent with extreme violence. Yet there were no bodies, no weapons, and no obvious suspects. The investigation into the Harmons' disappearance quickly became complicated. Neighbors reported nothing unusual. The couple's bank accounts showed no recent unusual activity, just their regular Social Security deposits and modest withdrawals for groceries and utilities. Their cell phones had last pinged towers near their home 12 days earlier, before apparently being turned off. The breakthrough came 3 days into the investigation, when Sheriff Colson interviewed the Harmons' adult son, Wesley, who lived in Cincinnati. Wesley hadn't spoken to his parents in over a month, not unusual given their strained relationship. But what caught Sheriff Coulson's attention was his alibi. He claimed to have been on a business trip to Seattle during the estimated time of his parents' disappearance, which airline records confirmed. What troubled her was his lack of concern. Mom and Dad were always eccentric, Wesley told her with a shrug. Dad especially. They probably just decided to take off somewhere without telling anyone. They've done it before. When pressed further, Wesley revealed something that sent the investigation in a new direction. His father, Leonard Harmon, had worked as a dispatcher for the Elderwood County Sheriff's Department for nearly 30 years, before retiring in 2009. Leonard had been known for his encyclopedic memory of the county roads and his unfailing politeness. But according to Wesley, he had also harbored a fascination with unsolved cases. Dad kept records of every call he ever dispatched, Wesley explained. He had this filing system in his home office. Mom said it got worse after he retired. He'd spend hours updating his files with newspaper clippings, listening to the scanner. He was obsessed with cases that didn't get solved on his watch. Sheriff Coulson obtained a warrant to search Leonard's home office more thoroughly. Behind a bookshelf, they discovered a hidden door leading to a small room papered with maps, photographs, and handwritten notes. Pushpins connected locations with colored strings. Calendar dates were circled in red. Most disturbing were the surveillance photos of at least a dozen different people, many of whom Sheriff Coulson recognized as county residents. Among Leonard's papers were detailed notes on 3 unsolved disappearances that had occurred in Elderwood County between 1985 and 2007, all cases he had dispatched officers to during his tenure. Each file contained information that had never been released to the public, suggesting Leonard had accessed confidential case files or had knowledge that he had never shared with investigators. The investigation took an even darker turn when forensic technicians matched DNA from the basement blood to 2 of the people from Leonard's surveillance photos. Darla Jenkins, a 42-year-old nurse who had been reported missing 6 months earlier, and Thomas Whitaker, a 38-year-old mechanic who had disappeared just 3 weeks before the Harmons. As Sheriff Coulson dug deeper, a disturbing picture emerged. Leonard Harmon, the trusted dispatcher who had served the department for decades, appeared to have been using his position to identify vulnerable targets and collect information on unsolved cases. His retirement hadn't ended his obsession. It had only given him more time to pursue it. The search expanded to include the entire Harmon property. Cadaver dogs alerted on multiple locations in the surrounding woods, but ground-penetrating radar revealed nothing conclusive. It wasn't until they searched an old well on the property that they found human remains, not of the Harmons, but of Darla Jenkins, whose body had been wrapped in plastic and weighted down. Sheriff Coulson organized a task force that included FBI agents specializing in serial offenders. They began the painstaking process of cross-referencing Leonard's notes with cold cases across 3 counties. The pattern that emerged was chilling. For decades, people had disappeared along the rural routes of Elderwood County, many of them passing through areas where Leonard Harmon had been the dispatcher handling emergency calls. He wasn't just studying these cases, an FBI analyst told Sheriff Coulson. He was creating them, then inserting himself into the investigations through his position. It's a classic case of what we call hero homicide, creating a problem so you can be part of solving it, or at least be close to the investigation. But this theory didn't explain the Harmons' disappearance or the scene in their basement. If Leonard was the killer, what had happened to him and his wife? Had they fled when they realized an investigation was imminent? Had Leonard killed his wife and then himself somewhere they hadn't yet searched? Or was there another explanation entirely? The answer came from an unexpected source. A routine check of border crossing records revealed that Martha Harmon's passport had been scanned at a crossing into Canada the day after the couple was last seen. Security footage showed an elderly woman matching Martha's description in the passenger seat of a car, driven by a middle-aged man who was definitely not Leonard Harmon. Facial recognition software identified the driver as Robert Pearson, a former paramedic who had worked closely with Leonard for years, responding to calls that Leonard had dispatched. Further investigation revealed that Pearson had abruptly resigned his position 3 years earlier and moved to a neighboring county. His DNA was found among the blood evidence in the Harmon's basement. The working theory shifted dramatically. Now investigators believed that Leonard and Martha Harmon had likely become victims of Leonard's former colleague, perhaps because Leonard knew too much about Pearson's activities or had somehow threatened him. The blood evidence suggested that both Leonard and Thomas Whitaker had been killed in the basement, with Martha either being kidnapped or coerced into leaving with Pearson. 6 weeks into the investigation, Canadian authorities located Pearson in a remote cabin near Thunder Bay, Ontario. Martha Harmon was found alive, but heavily sedated. During questioning, Pearson confessed to killing Leonard Harmon and Thomas Whitaker, claiming that Leonard had discovered his involvement in several disappearances over the years and had been blackmailing him. Leonard wasn't trying to solve those cases, Pearson told investigators. He was collecting trophies. He knew what I'd done because he helped coordinate it all. He used his position to identify targets and direct responders away from areas where he knew bodies were hidden. He kept records of everything. Insurance, he called it. Martha Harmon, once she recovered enough to be interviewed, confirmed the unthinkable. Her husband of 52 years had indeed been involved in disappearances dating back to the 1980s, not as the killer, but as the facilitator, using his dispatch position to identify isolated locations, monitor police movements, and occasionally delay response times to give his accomplices, including Pearson, enough time to commit their crimes and escape. He called it conducting the orchestra, Martha admitted, her hands trembling as she spoke. Leonard said he could never do the physical part himself, but he enjoyed the planning, the power of knowing. He recruited others, usually first responders who showed a certain interest. Robert was just the latest. The partnership had dissolved when Pearson had wanted to stop, and Leonard had threatened to expose him. The confrontation in the basement had turned violent, resulting in both Leonard's death and that of Thomas Whitaker, who had been held captive in a hidden room discovered behind a false wall in the basement, a room not included in the original house plans. For Sheriff Coulson, the case represented a profound betrayal. Leonard Harmon had been a trusted colleague, the calm voice on the radio guiding deputies to emergencies for decades. He had sat in the heart of the department, privy to every crime, every victim, every vulnerability in the system. And he had exploited that position not just to commit crimes, but to orchestrate them through others, while maintaining his reputation as a dedicated public servant. In the end, the task force linked Leonard Harmon's orchestra to 17 disappearances across 3 decades. Robert Pearson was sentenced to life without parole for multiple counts of murder. Martha Harmon, who claimed she had lived in fear of her husband for years, but had never participated in his crimes, received a lesser sentence for her silence and complicity. The case prompted a nationwide review of cold cases in jurisdictions where long-serving dispatchers or support staff had access to sensitive information. New protocols were implemented, requiring regular rotation of dispatch personnel and more thorough background checks. But for many in Elderwood County, the damage was already done. The voice they had trusted to send help in their darkest moments had sometimes been deciding who lived and who disappeared without a trace. Sheriff Colson continued to serve Elderwood County, though the case left her with a persistent insomnia and a habit of personally checking on elderly residents far more often than protocol required. In a rare interview years later, she reflected on the case that had fundamentally changed how she viewed her profession. The truly frightening thing about Leonard Harmon wasn't just what he did, she said. It was that he represented the system people trusted to protect them. When you call 911, you never think about who's answering that call or what they might be thinking. You just trust that help is on the way. Leonard violated that trust in the most fundamental way possible. He turned the lifeline into a snare. Today, the Harmon farmhouse stands empty, its windows boarded up, the property seized by the county. Local children whisper stories about the dispatcher's house, where bad things happened to people who called for help. But the real legacy of the case lives on in the procedures and safeguards now standard in emergency services across the country. Silent acknowledgement that sometimes the monster isn't hiding in the woods or breaking into your home. Sometimes it's the reassuring voice on the other end of the line when you call for help. Sheriff James Donovan of Crescent Valley, Nevada, had built his 23-year career on a foundation of methodical investigation and careful attention to detail. In the sprawling desert county, where distances between towns could be measured in hours rather than miles, resources were limited, and a sheriff needed to be resourceful. Perhaps that's why the Stillman case affected him so deeply. It defied the logical approach that had solved every other case in his jurisdiction. It began in October 2017 with what appeared to be a straightforward home invasion. Rebecca Stillman, a 36-year-old accountant who worked remotely from her modest ranch house on the outskirts of town, called 911 at 2:14 a.m., reporting that someone was trying to break into her home. "They're at the back door," she whispered to the dispatcher, her voice tight with fear. "I can hear them trying the handle. Please hurry." The dispatcher kept Rebecca on the line while Sheriff Donovan and Deputy Garcia responded. According to the call log, Rebecca suddenly gasped approximately 4 minutes after placing the call. "They're inside," she whispered. "They're in the house." The line went dead moments later. When Sheriff Donovan arrived 12 minutes after the initial call, a rapid response time given the remote location, the house was silent. The back door stood open, swinging gently in the night breeze. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed. Rebecca's laptop sat open on the kitchen table next to a half-empty cup of tea. Her phone was found on the living room floor. The screen cracked as if dropped in haste. But Rebecca Stillman was nowhere to be found. The investigation began as a possible kidnapping. Sheriff Donovan organized search parties that combed the surrounding desert for days. Helicopter sweeps revealed nothing but empty landscapes stretching to the mountains. Rebecca's car remained in her garage. Her bank accounts showed no activity. Her family in Seattle hadn't heard from her in over a week, but they said that wasn't unusual. Rebecca valued her independence and privacy. She moved here to get away from people, her sister told Sheriff Donovan during a tearful phone interview. She had some bad experiences in Seattle. That's why she installed all those security cameras. This was the first the sheriff had heard about security cameras. A more thorough search of the property revealed a sophisticated system, motion-activated cameras covering every approach to the house, all feeding to a cloud storage account. The system required a password, which Rebecca's sister provided. What Sheriff Donovan discovered in the footage would haunt him for years to come. The cameras had indeed captured someone approaching Rebecca's home on the night of her disappearance. A tall, thin figure moving with unusual fluidity across the yard. The image quality was excellent, capturing every detail of the person's appearance as they tried each window before moving to the back door. But one crucial element was missing: a face. Where the intruder's face should have been, the footage showed only a blurred smudge, as if that specific area had been digitally obscured. Could be a mask, Deputy Garcia suggested when they reviewed the footage, or some kind of technical glitch. Sheriff Donovan, never one to jump to conclusions, had the footage analyzed by technical experts from the state police. They confirmed that there was no evidence of digital tampering. Whatever had caused the facial blur had happened during recording. The investigation took an even stranger turn when they checked the interior cameras. Rebecca had installed them in every room, unusual for someone living alone, but perhaps understandable given her apparent concerns about security. The footage showed Rebecca in her living room, suddenly looking up as if hearing a noise. She picked up her phone, presumably to call 911. Then she froze, staring directly at something off camera. The timestamp matched exactly when she had whispered to the dispatcher that someone was trying to break in. But according to the footage, no one had entered the room yet. She appeared to be reacting to nothing. Minutes later, the camera captured Rebecca backing away from something not visible in the frame, her expression one of absolute terror. She dropped her phone, turned, and ran toward her bedroom. The bedroom camera showed her entering, locking the door, and wedging a chair under the handle. She backed toward the window, clearly intending to escape. Then she stopped. Her head turned slowly toward the corner of the room, a corner not covered by any camera angle. Her face drained of color, her mouth opened in what must have been a scream, though the cameras recorded no audio. She pressed herself against the wall, sliding down until she sat huddled on the floor, her eyes fixed on that same corner. The footage showed Rebecca sitting there, unmoving, for nearly 7 minutes. Then, without any visible cause, her body jerked violently. Her back arched at an impossible angle. She rose slowly to her feet, her movements stiff and unnatural, as if she were a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. She walked to her bedroom door, removed the chair, unlocked it, and walked out of frame. The final piece of footage, from the camera covering the back door, showed Rebecca walking out into the desert night, moving with that same stiff, unnatural gait. She did not take her phone, her purse, or even her shoes. She simply walked into the darkness until she passed beyond the camera's range, and she was never seen again. Sheriff Donovan threw every resource available into the investigation. Cadaver dogs searched the surrounding desert for miles. Forensic teams went over the house inch by inch. Technical experts analyzed the camera footage frame by frame. But no trace of Rebecca Stillman was found, and no explanation for what the cameras had captured. The only potential lead came from Rebecca's computer. Her browser history showed repeated visits to online forums, discussing stalking and home security. In the weeks before her disappearance, she had searched for information about how to know if someone has been in your house while you were away, and signs someone is watching you. Her final search, just hours before her disappearance, was for what to do if cameras don't show them. Sheriff Donovan interviewed Rebecca's neighbors, though the nearest lived over a mile away. Most knew little about the private accountant, who rarely ventured into town. But one elderly couple mentioned something that caught his attention. They had sometimes seen Rebecca standing in her yard at night, staring into the darkness, as if watching for something. "We thought maybe she was stargazing," the husband said. "The sky's so clear out here, but she always seemed tense, like she was expecting someone." 3 months into the investigation, with no new leads and pressure mounting from Rebecca's family and the media, Sheriff Donovan made a decision that his deputies questioned. He would spend a night in Rebecca's house alone, hoping to notice something that might have been missed during previous searches. "Sometimes you need to experience a location the way the victim did," he explained. see it through their eyes. Sheriff Donovan arrived at the Stillman house just before sundown, equipped with his service weapon, a radio, and a laptop to review the security footage again. He walked through each room methodically, noting the careful organization of Rebecca's possessions, the multiple locks on every window and door, the strategic placement of the cameras. She was definitely afraid of something, he dictated into his recorder. The question is, was it real or imagined? As night fell across the desert, Sheriff Donovan continued his examination, focusing on the bedroom where Rebecca had experienced her final moments of terror. Nothing seemed unusual, just a neatly made bed, a bookshelf full of thriller novels, and a dresser with family photos. The corner she had stared at contained nothing but bare wall. Around midnight, with no new insights, Sheriff Donovan decided to review the security footage one more time. He sat at Rebecca's kitchen table, just as she had done, and opened the files on his laptop. Something about watching the footage in the very house where it had been recorded gave him a new perspective. He noticed subtle details he had missed before, the way Rebecca would occasionally glance toward empty doorways while working at her computer, the fact that she never turned her back to an open door, the way she would sometimes freeze and listen intently before continuing with her tasks. These weren't the actions of someone who merely valued privacy. These were the behaviors of someone who felt hunted. On an impulse, Sheriff Donovan checked the camera system's settings. He discovered that Rebecca had set the motion detection sensitivity unusually high enough that it might trigger false alarms from shadows or small animals. Yet scanning through weeks of archived footage, he found very few false alarms. The system worked perfectly, except for one strange pattern. Approximately once a week, all cameras would simultaneously go offline for exactly 17 minutes, usually between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock a.m. The system logs showed these as connection errors, but their regularity seemed suspicious. The most recent such outage had occurred the night before Rebecca's disappearance. Sheriff Donovan was still pondering this discovery when he heard a sound from elsewhere in the house, a soft scraping, like furniture being carefully moved. He drew his weapon and moved silently toward the source of the noise, using his flashlight sparingly to avoid announcing his presence. The sound had come from Rebecca's bedroom. The door stood partially open, though Sheriff Donovan distinctly remembered closing it earlier. Heart pounding, he approached cautiously, calling out, "Sheriff's Department, anyone in there?" No response. He pushed the door open with his foot, weapon raised, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room appeared empty, exactly as he had left it hours before. But as he swept the beam across the room, he noticed something that turned his blood cold. The closet door, which had definitely been closed during his earlier examination, now stood open, just a crack. Sheriff Donovan approached the closet carefully, every sense heightened. With one swift movement, he yanked the door fully open, prepared to confront whoever, or whatever, might be hiding inside. The closet was empty except for Rebecca's neatly hung clothes and a few storage boxes on the upper shelf. Sheriff Donovan exhaled slowly, feeling somewhat foolish for his tension. He was about to close the door when he noticed something odd about the back wall of the closet. The house had been built in the 1970s, when hidden rooms and passages were not uncommon in remote properties. Pressing against what appeared to be solid wall, Sheriff Donovan felt a slight give. Further investigation revealed a concealed door, expertly camouflaged to match the surrounding wall. It had no handle, opening instead with a push mechanism. The door swung inward to reveal a narrow space, no more than a crawl space between walls, barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through. Sheriff Donovan's flashlight beam revealed a disturbing sight. The inner walls were covered with photographs of Rebecca Stillman. Rebecca sleeping, Rebecca working at her computer, Rebecca in the shower, all taken from angles impossible for her exterior security cameras. Someone had been living in her walls, watching her through small holes drilled at strategic locations throughout the house. Holes so small they had been overlooked during the initial investigation. But that wasn't the most disturbing discovery. At the far end of the crawl space lay a makeshift bed, consisting of a thin blanket and pillow. Beside it sat a sophisticated signal jammer, capable of temporarily disabling wireless security systems. And pinned to the wall was a crude map of the surrounding desert, with an X marked at a location approximately 5 miles from the house. Sheriff Donovan immediately called for backup and a forensic team. While waiting for their arrival, he continued to document the hidden room, finding protein bars, water bottles, and a notebook filled with detailed observations of Rebecca's daily routine, sleeping habits, and security measures. The final entry, dated the night of her disappearance, contained only 5 words. Tonight she joins the others. At dawn, Sheriff Donovan led a team to the location marked on the map. Using ground-penetrating radar, they located a disturbed area of soil. Excavation revealed a makeshift grave containing the remains of Rebecca Stillman. But she wasn't alone. The grave also held the remains of 2 other women who had been reported missing from neighboring counties over the past 5 years. All 3 had died from asphyxiation. Forensic evidence collected from the crawlspace eventually led to the arrest of Paul Mercer, a 42-year-old maintenance worker who had serviced Rebecca's heating system shortly after she moved in. Mercer had a minor criminal record for voyeurism, but had never been suspected of violent crimes. During his confession, he revealed that he had modified several homes in the area, creating hidden spaces from which he could observe the occupants without their knowledge. They never knew I was there, he told investigators. I could watch them for months. I knew everything about them. When they slept, what they ate, what they feared. Rebecca was special, though. She sensed me somehow. She kept looking right at me, even though she couldn't see me. When asked about the security footage showing Rebecca's strange behavior and unnatural movements before walking into the desert, Mercer simply smiled. I drugged her tea, he explained. The rest was just persuasion. It's amazing what people will do when they're certain they're already being hunted by something worse than you. For Sheriff Donovan, the case represented both a professional success and a personal failure. They had caught a serial killer and brought closure to 3 families, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he should have found the hidden room during the initial investigation. If he had, perhaps Rebecca might have been found alive. The case changed how rural law enforcement approached missing persons investigations throughout the region. Deputies were now trained to look for signs of hidden observation points and to check for signal disruptions that might indicate security tampering. Homeowners in isolated areas were advised to install systems with backup power and cellular connections that couldn't be easily jammed. But for Sheriff Donovan, the most profound change was psychological. He had always seen his county as a place where the greatest dangers came from the harsh landscape and occasional desperate criminal. The idea that ordinary houses could conceal such elaborate mechanisms of stalking and terror, that the walls themselves might literally have eyes, shattered that perception forever. In his final report on the case, Sheriff Donovan wrote, "The most disturbing aspect of this investigation was not the methodology of the crimes, but how effectively the perpetrator exploited the victim's isolation and psychological state. Rebecca Stillman knew someone was watching her. She took every reasonable precaution, installed every security measure available, and yet, the very walls she trusted to protect her had been weaponized against her. In our increasingly isolated society, where technology promises security, but often delivers only the illusion of it. This case stands as a sobering reminder. Sometimes the monster isn't trying to break in. Sometimes it's already inside, watching and waiting. Today, the Stillman house remains empty, its reputation tainted by the crimes discovered within its walls. Real estate laws in Nevada now require disclosure of such criminal histories to potential buyers. But Sheriff Donovan, who retired 2 years after solving the case, still drives past the property occasionally, wondering how many other homes in his former jurisdiction might harbor similar secrets behind their walls. Sheriff Teresa Randall couldn't shake the chill that had settled in her bones, despite the sweltering July heat that had gripped Lakeside County, Alabama. For weeks, standing at the edge of another carefully arranged crime scene, she knew they were dealing with something unprecedented in the department's history. It was the third such scene in 7 weeks. Like the others, everything about it appeared meticulously choreographed. The victim, Martin Haywood, 43 high school chemistry teacher, lay on his living room floor, positioned with arms crossed over his chest. His eyes had been closed, his face cleaned of blood. His home showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. Nothing appeared to be stolen, except for exactly 8 hours of his life. Same timeline as the others, Deputy Lewis said, referring to the notebook where he'd compiled the patterns they'd identified. Victim was last seen leaving the pharmacy at 8:42 p.m., called in sick to work the next morning via text at 4:38 a.m. Body discovered after he didn't show up for the second day, approximately 46 hours after the estimated time of death. What connected these cases, beyond the staged bodies and lack of obvious motive, was the most disturbing element of all. In each instance, home security cameras or electronic devices had captured the same unexplained phenomenon. 8 hours of footage completely missing, despite systems showing no evidence of tampering or malfunction. Just a perfect gap in the digital record, as if time itself had been excised from the night. "It's like our guy isn't just taking lives," Sheriff Randall said, examining the precise positioning of the victim's hands. "He's taking time." The press had dubbed him the Night Collector, a name Sheriff Randall detested for its romanticized quality, but one that had unfortunately stuck. 3 victims in 7 weeks, each killed with a single puncture wound to the carotid artery, each positioned the same way, each with exactly 8 hours missing from their security systems. The first victim had been Caroline Mercer, a 38-year-old accountant who worked from home. The second was Peter Gladwell, a 45-year-old night shift nurse. Now Martin Haywood. On the surface, they had nothing in common beyond living alone in single-family homes within the same county. "Sheriff, you need to see this," called the department's digital forensics specialist, hunched over Haywood's laptop. "I found something in his browser history." The specialist pulled up a local community forum where Haywood had been active in a discussion thread about home security recommendations. Caroline Mercer and Peter Gladwell had participated in the same thread, each describing their security setups in detail. All 3 had installed the same brand of cameras within weeks of each other, prompted by a series of break-ins reported in neighboring counties. He's selecting them through the forum, Sheriff Randall realized. They're telling him exactly what security they have and how to bypass it. Further investigation revealed that all 3 victims had received home security consultations from Sentinel Systems, a local company that had expanded rapidly over the past year. Background checks on all employees came back clean, but Sheriff Randall wasn't satisfied. She obtained a warrant for the company's client records and installation schedules. The breakthrough came when they discovered that all 3 victims had been scheduled for system updates in the weeks before their deaths. Each time, the technician assigned was listed as A. Reynolds. a name that didn't match any current employee. The update appointments were all scheduled for late afternoon, Deputy Lewis noted. Last appointments of the day. Sheriff Randall ordered surveillance footage from businesses near each victim's home on the days of these supposed updates. In the footage from a gas station near Martin Haywood's house, they spotted a Sentinel Systems van arriving for the scheduled appointment. The driver, wearing a company uniform and cap pulled low, kept his face carefully angled away from cameras. "He's using their security against them," Sheriff Randall said, installing his own back door during legitimate service calls. When they examined the security cameras from each victim's home, they found tiny modifications, almost imperceptible alterations that would allow someone with the right equipment to temporarily disable the systems remotely, creating those perfect 8-hour gaps. The killer wasn't just taking their lives, he was taking his time with them, erasing the record of whatever happened during those missing hours. Sheriff Randall ordered protection for everyone on Sentinel's client list who had received system updates in the past 6 months. She also released a carefully worded public statement, warning residents about a security scam without causing panic or alerting the killer that they were closing in. The investigation led them to Anthony Reynolds, a former Sentinel Systems employee who had been fired 6 months earlier for erratic behavior, according to company records. Reynolds had been a model employee for 3 years until suffering a home invasion that left his wife in a coma. When she died after exactly 8 weeks, something in Reynolds had broken. He had become obsessed with the fact that their own security system, installed by the very company he worked for, had failed to protect his family. Reynolds' personnel file included a photo, a thin man with hollow eyes and a distinct scar along his jawline. The same man barely visible in the gas station footage. His last known address was a dead end, the apartment vacant for months. His bank accounts showed no activity since shortly after his termination. Sheriff Randall dug deeper into Reynolds' background, discovering that before joining Sentinel Systems, he had served in the military as a communications specialist with advanced training in electronic surveillance. He had the expertise to create the perfect technological blind spot, 8 hours during which he could do whatever he wanted to his victims with no digital witnesses. The question that haunted Sheriff Randall as the investigation continued: what was happening during those missing hours? The autopsies showed no signs of torture or sexual assault. The victims were killed with a single precise wound, suggesting either medical knowledge or extensive research. The ritualistic positioning of the bodies indicated someone who respected the dead even as he created them. The case broke open when a fourth potential victim, Sarah Keller, another Sentinel Systems customer who had recently received an update, called 911 reporting a strange malfunction in her security system. Sheriff Randall and 3 deputies responded immediately. They arrived to find Keller unharmed, but confused about why her system had suddenly gone offline, despite showing green status lights. Sheriff Randall immediately recognized the signs. He's here, or about to be. She ordered Keller evacuated and set up a perimeter around the house, keeping just enough presence visible to be detected without revealing their full deployment. At 11:47 p.m., a dark figure approached the back of the property, moving with practiced confidence through blind spots in the standard security camera setup. Sheriff Randall gave the signal, and her team closed in. Anthony Reynolds was apprehended without incident, carrying a backpack containing surgical gloves, a folding knife with a sterilized blade, and a tablet device loaded with software capable of hijacking wireless networks. The most disturbing item, however, was a small leather-bound journal. Inside, Reynolds had meticulously documented each victim, including photographs taken during the missing hours. The images showed them not bruised or bloody, but seated across from him at their own dining tables, apparently engaged in conversation. According to his written accounts, Reynolds spent those hours helping them understand their flawed sense of security before offering them the mercy of awareness at the end. During interrogation, Reynolds spoke calmly, almost clinically, about his actions. 8 hours is how long my wife was alone, bleeding, before I found her, he explained. 8 hours she spent dying while I was at work, trusting our security system. I wanted them to understand what false security costs. I wanted them to have the gift of knowing when death was coming. The gift my wife didn't have. When asked why he positioned the bodies so carefully, Reynolds replied, "They deserved dignity in death. They weren't guilty of anything except the same ignorance that killed my wife, believing that technology can keep the darkness out." Sheriff Randall's investigation uncovered dozens more potential targets from Sentinel's client list, all marked in Reynolds' journal for future conversations. The case resulted in major reforms in how security companies vet employees and perform installations, with mandatory two-person teams and enhanced verification procedures. For Sheriff Randall, however, the case left an indelible mark. She found herself checking and rechecking her own home security system, installing redundant measures that didn't rely on wireless connections. The 8-hour gaps in the victim's final moments remained a source of particular discomfort. The knowledge that technology designed to record and remember could be so easily made to forget. The scariest part wasn't the killings themselves, she later told a class of law enforcement trainees. It was the realization that in our modern world, we've outsourced our safety to systems we don't fully understand. Anthony Reynolds didn't just exploit technical vulnerabilities. He exploited our psychological need to believe we're protected. In the end, what made him so effective wasn't technological sophistication, but his understanding of how desperately we need to feel safe in our own homes. Reynolds was sentenced to life without parole. During his sentencing hearing, he spoke only once, addressing the victims' families directly. Your loved ones weren't afraid at the end. They finally understood something most people never do, that genuine security doesn't come from cameras or alarms. It comes from accepting that nothing can truly protect us from what waits in the darkness. To this day, Sheriff Randall keeps a photograph from the case pinned to her office wall, not of the crime scenes or the perpetrator, but of a simple home security panel showing a steady green light, a constant reminder that our sense of safety often rests on technological promises that are far more fragile than we care to admit. Sheriff Dwayne Carter had patrolled the roads of Lake County, Michigan for 17 years. The rural jurisdiction, dotted with dense forests and over 100 small lakes, attracted summer tourists and winter sportsmen in equal measure. But in the transitional months, those soggy gray weeks of late October, when the tourists had gone and the snow had yet to fall, the county belonged again to its permanent residents. It was during one such dismal autumn in 2013 that Sheriff Carter found himself investigating a case that would forever change how he viewed the seemingly tranquil waters of his jurisdiction. The first indication that something was wrong came when Earl Mason, a retired postal worker and avid fisherman, failed to return from an afternoon on Blackwood Lake. His wife reported him missing after he hadn't returned by nightfall, unusual for a man known for his punctuality. Sheriff Carter organized a search party that found Mason's small aluminum fishing boat drifting near the center of the lake early the next morning. His fishing gear was still in place, a half-empty thermos of coffee secured in its holder. But of Earl Mason himself, there was no sign. "It's like he just stepped off the boat," Deputy Wilson remarked as they towed the vessel to shore. "No signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing missing except the man himself. The initial theory was straightforward enough. Mason had somehow fallen overboard and drowned. It happened occasionally, especially with older fishermen. But something about the scene bothered Sheriff Carter. The boat was too orderly, the fishing line still baited and ready, and Mason had been an excellent swimmer, despite his 70 years, having served as the county's swimming instructor for decades before retirement. 3 days of dragging the lake produced no body. Sheriff Carter was preparing to scale back the search when a call came in from another lake 15 miles away. Another boat had been found drifting, this one belonging to Lisa Hendricks, a 38-year-old biology teacher who had gone out to collect water samples for her class. Like Mason's boat, everything was in place. Her sample containers neatly labeled, her equipment organized. But Lisa herself had vanished. 2 people don't just disappear off their boats in the same week, Sheriff Carter told his deputies during the emergency briefing, not without leaving some trace. When Lisa's body was discovered 2 days later by a dog walker along the shore of yet another lake, Crescent Lake, about 8 miles from where her boat had been found, the case took an even more disturbing turn. The medical examiner determined she had drowned, but under suspicious circumstances that suggested foul play rather than accident. Sheriff Carter ordered a more thorough search of Blackwood Lake, where Earl Mason had disappeared. This time, divers focused on underwater features rather than simply dragging the bottom. What they discovered, hidden beneath a rocky outcropping, confirmed the sheriff's worst fears. Mason had not simply fallen overboard. Evidence suggested he had been deliberately targeted. This wasn't some fishing accident, Sheriff Carter concluded grimly. Someone's hunting on our lakes. Further examination revealed another disturbing connection. Both victims had been rendered unconscious before entering the water. The medical examiner believed they had been unconscious when first submerged, but may have regained consciousness before drowning, a particularly horrific fate. Sheriff Carter's investigation revealed that 3 other drownings in neighboring counties over the past 2 years shared similar characteristics, though they had been classified as accidents due to the bodies being discovered in varying states of decomposition. In each case, the victim had been alone on a lake in a small boat during off-season months. In each case, the boat had been found drifting, undisturbed, except for the missing occupant. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Reviewing Mason's and Hendricks's movements in the days before their deaths, Sheriff Carter discovered they had both visited the same bait shop on the county line, Lakeside Tackle and Supplies. When he interviewed the shop's owner, Frank Doherty, nothing seemed immediately suspicious about the middle-aged man who had run the business for nearly a decade. But a background check revealed that Doherty had moved to Michigan shortly after 2 similar drowning cases in Minnesota, where he had previously operated a marina. A deeper dive into Doherty's past uncovered a pattern of relocations following similar incidents across 3 states. In each location, he had established businesses catering to lake recreation, becoming a familiar figure to local boaters and fishermen. His position gave him unique insights into the patterns and behaviors of people who ventured onto the lakes alone. Sheriff Carter obtained a search warrant for Doherty's lakefront home and the storage shed behind his shop. What they found confirmed their suspicions. Detailed maps of all local lakes with certain areas carefully marked, specialized diving equipment that showed signs of frequent use, and a collection of seemingly mundane items, a fishing license, a class ring, a monogrammed thermos, that appeared to be mementos connected to the missing persons cases. Most concerning was a journal in which Doherty had meticulously documented his observations. He described watching people from shore using high-powered spotting scopes, learning their routines, and eventually approaching their boats under the guise of a fellow fisherman in distress or a lake maintenance worker. The journal detailed methods of gaining people's trust while they were isolated on the water. But it was Doherty's philosophy, revealed in his writings, that disturbed Sheriff Carter most deeply. The man didn't seem motivated by typical factors. Instead, Doherty wrote about an obsessive fascination with the lakes themselves and what he called the moment of truth, when people realized they were in danger. They finally see the water for what it truly is, Doherty had written. Not just a surface for recreation, but a deep unknown world. That's when they understand what I've always known, that we're all just temporarily safe, surrounded by forces beyond our control. When Sheriff Carter and his deputies arrived to arrest Doherty, they found his house empty, but his boat missing from its dock. A county-wide lake patrol was immediately organized. They located Doherty's boat after nightfall on the far side of Wellington Lake, the deepest in the county. But of Doherty himself, there was no sign, just an empty boat drifting silently in the moonlight. For 3 days, divers searched Wellington Lake without success. On the 4th day, a sudden storm halted the search, churning the lake's surface into whitecaps that made water operations impossible. When conditions cleared, the search resumed with a new theory. Perhaps Doherty, realizing he was about to be captured, had deliberately vanished into the waters he had been obsessed with. They eventually located evidence suggesting Doherty had indeed gone into the lake voluntarily. Unlike his victims, who had been taken by surprise, Doherty appeared to have planned his final moments carefully. A waterproof camera recovered from the scene contained images of the lake from below, showing light filtering down through the water in ethereal patterns. His final message to the world. The case was technically closed with Doherty's presumed death, but its effects lingered throughout Lake County. Sheriff Carter found himself forever changed by the investigation, unable to look at the county's scenic lakes without thinking about what might lie beneath their placid surfaces. Water keeps its secrets, he told a reporter during a rare interview years later. That's what makes this case so disturbing. Those lakes had been the community's pride, places of recreation and natural beauty. Doherty's actions changed how we see them. He didn't just harm individuals. He poisoned our relationship with the natural world around us. For the residents of Lake County, the case fundamentally altered their relationship with the waters that defined their community. New ordinances required fishing boats to carry GPS trackers and emergency beacons. The buddy system, once casually observed, became an ironclad rule among locals. Parents warned children never to approach strangers near the water, regardless of how harmless they might appear. Perhaps most telling was the sharp decline in solo fishing, once a cherished tradition in a county where solitude on the water had been considered a form of therapy rather than a risk. The lakes eventually reclaimed their place in community life, but never quite as they had been before. Beneath every calm surface now lurked the knowledge that the boundary between safety and danger was as thin and fragile as the reflection of sky on water. Sheriff Carter continued serving Lake County until his retirement in 2021, but he never again went fishing alone. On his office wall hung a photograph of Wellington Lake at sunset, its surface a perfect mirror of crimson clouds. To visitors, it appeared to be simply an appreciation of local beauty. But for Carter, it served as a daily reminder that the most dangerous predators are those who understand not just how to harm others, but how to forever change how we perceive the world around us, turning places of peace into repositories of fear, one ripple at a time. Sheriff Lucas Morgan had seen his share of strange cases during his 14 years serving Juniper County, Arizona. But the call that came in on a scorching July morning in 2016 marked the beginning of something that would challenge his understanding of human nature in ways he'd never anticipated. The call came from Elaine Winters, a 68-year-old widow who lived alone in a ranch-style home on the outskirts of town. Her voice trembled as she explained that someone had broken into her house while she slept. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Not her television, not her jewelry, not even the cash she kept in a drawer by the front door. The only things missing were the photographs from every frame in her house. Just the photographs, she repeated, confusion evident in her voice. They left the frames completely empty. Sheriff Morgan might have dismissed it as a prank, perhaps local teenagers with too much time on their hands during summer break, if not for the second call that came in just 3 hours later. Thomas Reeves, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher who lived nearly 15 miles from Elaine Winters, reported an identical break-in. Again, nothing of apparent value had been taken. Only the photographs had disappeared from their frames, which were left neatly in place throughout his home. By the end of the week, 5 more elderly residents had reported the same bizarre crime. In each case, the pattern was identical. The victims were all over 65, living alone in single-story homes. The break-ins occurred while they slept, with no signs of forced entry, and only photographs were taken: family portraits, wedding pictures, vacation snapshots, leaving behind empty frames like hollow eyes staring from walls and mantels. It's like they're collecting memories, not valuables, Deputy Hayes suggested during the investigation briefing. Question is, why these particular people? Why just their photos? Sheriff Morgan began mapping the break-ins, looking for geographical patterns. The homes were scattered across the county, with no obvious connection between them. The victims didn't attend the same church, shop at the same stores, or participate in the same community activities. The only commonality was their age and living situation. The investigation took a darker turn when one of the victims, Marion Shelby, was found dead in her home 3 days after reporting her missing photographs. At first glance, it appeared to be natural causes, an 81-year-old woman with a history of heart problems. But the autopsy revealed something disturbing. Marion had died from an insulin overdose, despite not being diabetic. Sheriff Morgan immediately ordered wellness checks on all previous victims. 2 more were found dead in their homes, one from an apparent insulin overdose identical to Marion's, another from what looked like an accidental fall down basement stairs. Both had reported their missing photographs within the previous week. This isn't about the pictures, Sheriff Morgan realized. The pictures are just the first visit. The department shifted into high gear, assigning deputies to patrol neighborhoods with high concentrations of elderly residents living alone. Sheriff Morgan personally reviewed every unsolved case involving elderly victims from neighboring counties over the past 5 years. The breakthrough came when he discovered a similar pattern in Navajo County, approximately 80 miles away. 2 years earlier, 7 elderly residents had reported missing photographs, followed by 3 unexplained deaths within days. The investigating officer had suspected a connection, but couldn't prove it, and the cases eventually went cold. When Morgan contacted him, the officer revealed a crucial detail that hadn't made it into the official reports. One surviving victim had mentioned a home healthcare worker who had briefly substituted for her regular aide in the weeks before the break-in. Armed with this information, Sheriff Morgan began cross-referencing home healthcare agencies that operated in both counties. One name appeared repeatedly: Horizon Home Health, a seemingly reputable company that specialized in serving elderly clients in rural areas. When Morgan requested employee records from Horizon, he encountered immediate resistance. The company cited patient and employee privacy concerns, forcing him to obtain a warrant. By the time he received the records, 2 more victims had reported missing photographs, and another had been found dead, this time from apparent carbon monoxide poisoning due to a faulty water heater. The employee files revealed that a subset of Horizon's clients, those who had experienced the photograph thefts, had all been visited by the same substitute aide at some point in the month before the break-ins. The aide's name was Lisa Carver, a 43-year-old with impeccable references and a clean background check. Her employment record showed she moved frequently, working for different agencies across 3 states over the past decade. Sheriff Morgan located Carver's apartment on the border between Juniper and Navajo counties, a strategic location that had allowed her to work in both jurisdictions without raising suspicion. When they executed the search warrant, Carver wasn't home, but what they found inside the apartment chilled the veteran sheriff to the bone. An entire wall of the living room was covered with photographs, hundreds of them, arranged in a massive collage. These were the missing photos from the victims' homes, organized in clusters around central images of the victims themselves. But it was what they found in Carver's bedroom that revealed the true horror of her operation. A detailed notebook contained information on each victim, their daily routines, medications, security habits, and family contacts. Most disturbing were the methodical notes on her visits to their homes, both as a healthcare worker and during her nighttime intrusions. She documented how she had gradually adjusted the medications of certain victims, replaced their insulin, or tampered with appliances in their homes during her initial break-ins, setting the stage for deaths that would appear accidental or natural. "First, I take their images," she had written. "Then I return to take them." What made Carver's method so effective was its patience and precision. She selected victims who were already vulnerable, not just physically but socially isolated. The theft of photographs wasn't just a trophy-taking behavior. It was a calculated first step that allowed her to enter their homes, study the layouts, and make subtle preparations for her later visits. When she returned days later, she already knew exactly how to move through the houses undetected. Sheriff Morgan immediately issued a multi-county alert for Carver's arrest, but she had vanished, apparently tipped off by someone with knowledge of the investigation. When they tracked her employment history across state lines, they discovered a trail of elderly deaths stretching back nearly 15 years, all following the same pattern of missing photographs and seemingly unconnected deaths from natural causes or accidents. In each location, Carver had worked briefly for local home healthcare agencies, gaining access to vulnerable elderly clients before moving on, just as suspicions might have begun to form. Her methodology had been so subtle, her victims so carefully chosen, that individual deaths rarely triggered serious investigations. It was only the strange ritual of the photographs, her signature, her compulsion, that had finally created a pattern obvious enough to detect. 3 weeks into the manhunt, a night shift deputy noticed a car parked near the home of Vincent Gardner, an 84-year-old widower who lived alone on the edge of town. Gardner hadn't reported missing photographs, but he matched the profile of Carver's previous victims. When the deputy approached the vehicle, he found it empty but still warm, with a Horizon Home Health parking permit on the dashboard. Sheriff Morgan and 3 deputies surrounded Gardner's home, entering through the back door with the key Gardner had provided to emergency services years earlier. They found Carver in the bedroom, standing over Gardner's sleeping form with a syringe in her hand. On the nightstand lay a collection of family photographs she had already removed from their frames. Unlike many killers who, when caught, either deny everything or confess completely, Carver's behavior during her arrest and subsequent interrogation was unnervingly calm. She spoke about her victims with a detached, almost clinical interest, describing how she had been helping them avoid the indignities of extreme old age. "I gave them mercy," she explained to a disturbed Sheriff Morgan. "But I wanted to know them first. The photographs show who they were before they became trapped in failing bodies. I studied those images, understood who I was releasing, and then I took the pictures with me, so a part of them would continue. They're still with me now." Psychiatric evaluation revealed a woman whose grandmother had died slowly and painfully in a substandard nursing home, an event Carver had witnessed as a teenager. But this trauma alone seemed insufficient to explain the methodical, years-long killing spree. Some darker, more fundamental disconnect existed in her mind, allowing her to view herself as a compassionate agent rather than a predator. What most disturbed Sheriff Morgan, as the case proceeded to trial, was the realization that Carver had operated undetected for so long, precisely because her victims were people society had already begun to overlook. Elderly individuals living alone, their social connections often reduced by time and circumstance, made perfect targets for a predator patient enough to gain their trust. She exploited the invisibility we assign to the elderly, Morgan noted in his final case report. Her victims weren't selected despite their age and isolation, but because of it. She understood that deaths among the elderly rarely trigger the same level of scrutiny as those of younger victims, and she weaponized our collective blind spot. Carver was eventually convicted of 7 murders in Juniper County alone, with dozens more charged in other jurisdictions as evidence continued to accumulate. The case prompted a nationwide review of unexplained deaths among elderly individuals living alone, particularly those who had received home health care services. For Sheriff Morgan, the case fundamentally changed how his department approached community policing. He established a dedicated elder welfare unit and implemented regular check-in programs for seniors living alone. But he remained haunted by the knowledge that Carver had nearly succeeded in creating the perfect victims, people whose disappearance from the world was already partially underway in the form of social isolation, making their final disappearance that much easier to achieve. The wall of photographs found in Carver's apartment was preserved as evidence, those stolen memories never returning to the empty frames left behind in victims' homes. For the families of those victims, these vacant frames became powerful symbols of how their loved ones had been targeted, not for what they possessed, but for what they lacked: the protective presence of others in their daily lives. The most dangerous predators, Sheriff Morgan would later tell a criminology class at the State University, aren't necessarily the most violent or impulsive. They're the ones who recognize and exploit the gaps in our social fabric, the places where people have already started to slip through, unnoticed and unmissed. Lisa Carver didn't just kill individuals. She exploited an entire demographic blind spot, turning our collective neglect into her personal hunting ground. Today, the Juniper County Sheriff's Department maintains a collection of frames on the wall of their community outreach office. Not empty, but filled with photographs of elderly residents who participate in their safety programs. It serves as a reminder to deputies and community members alike that the most vulnerable among us require not just protection, but presence. The acknowledgement that their stories remain worthy of being framed, seen, and protected even as they enter life's final chapters. Sheriff Marla Keene of Dalton County, Georgia, had built her career on methodical police work and an uncanny ability to connect seemingly unrelated details. After 15 years with the department, she had earned a reputation for solving cases others dismissed as unsolvable. But in the spring of 2018, she encountered a case that would challenge her investigative skills like never before. It began with a single white envelope left on the hood of an abandoned car along Highway 27. Inside was a handwritten note describing in precise detail where to find the body of Melissa Rankin, a 24-year-old graduate student who had been reported missing 3 weeks earlier. The note included information about the crime scene that had never been released to the public. When Sheriff Keene and her deputies followed the directions to an overgrown gulch 5 miles from the highway, they found Rankin's remains, exactly as described. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation, with evidence suggesting she had been killed elsewhere and transported to the disposal site. Whoever wrote this note either killed her or witnessed the murder, Sheriff Keene told her investigative team. Either way, they know details only the killer would know. 2 weeks later, a second envelope appeared, this time on the windshield of a patrol car parked outside a local diner. The note inside described the location of another body, Jeremy Foster, a 32-year-old truck driver who hadn't even been reported missing yet. His family had assumed he was on a long-haul route. Foster's body was found in an abandoned barn 20 miles from town, again exactly as the note had described. Like Rankin, he had been strangled, though the medical examiner noted significant differences in technique between the two murders. "We're dealing with a serial killer," Deputy Hayes suggested during the briefing, "one who wants credit for his work." Sheriff Keene wasn't convinced. "These don't feel like the work of a single killer. The methods are too different, the victim profiles don't match, and there's no consistent signature besides the method of communication." A third envelope appeared a month later, left on a roadside memorial for a car accident victim along Highway 27. This note was different. It didn't describe a new victim, but instead contained intimate details about a 5-year-old unsolved homicide from a neighboring county, details that had been withheld from the press. Sheriff Keene contacted the lead investigator on that case and shared the contents of the note. "Whoever wrote this knows things only the killer would know," she explained. "But I don't think our note writer is the killer. I think there's something else entirely." The breakthrough came when forensic analysis revealed trace elements on the envelopes consistent with the industrial cleaner used by the state's highway rest stops. Sheriff Keene ordered a systematic check of all rest areas along Highway 27 and the connecting routes. At a small, rarely used rest stop near the county line, deputies discovered a maintenance closet that showed signs of recent habitation, a sleeping bag, food wrappers, and a small desk fashioned from an overturned crate. On the wall was a map of the region, with colored pins marking locations that corresponded to various crime scenes, not just the ones mentioned in the notes, but dozens more stretching back nearly a decade. "Our note writer has been living here," Sheriff Keene realized, "watching the highway, watching the people who travel it." Security camera footage from nearby gas stations and businesses revealed a pattern. The same nondescript sedan had been photographed near each location where an envelope had been left. The vehicle was registered to Raymond Gaines, a 58-year-old former long-haul trucker who had been medically discharged after a workplace accident left him with chronic pain and limited mobility 7 years earlier. When Sheriff Keene and her deputies arrived at Gaines's small apartment in a neighboring county, they found walls covered with news clippings about various crimes throughout the region. Notebooks filled with observations, times, license plate numbers, and detailed descriptions of vehicles and their occupants lined a bookshelf. A police scanner sat on his kitchen table beside a typewriter that matched the print characteristics of the notes. Gaines himself was found sitting calmly in his living room, seemingly expecting them. When questioned, he offered no resistance, instead appearing almost relieved to finally tell his story. "I see them," he explained during his initial interview. "The ones who stop when they think no one's watching. The ones who pull over to help a stranded motorist but have no good intentions. The ones who dump things in the night. I've been watching the highways for years. Gaines's accident had left him unable to drive long distances, but he could still manage short trips. He had developed a routine of parking at different vantage points along the highways, rest stops, scenic overlooks, abandoned buildings, and simply watching. What began as a way to stay connected to his former life on the road had evolved into something else entirely. "You see patterns when you watch long enough," he told Sheriff Keene. "The same vehicles circling back, the suspicious stops, the strange encounters. After a while, I started taking notes. Then I started following certain vehicles. I saw things, terrible things." According to Gaines, he had witnessed numerous crimes over the years, including disposal of evidence, and, in at least 3 cases, the transportation of victims to remote locations. His mobility issues prevented him from intervening directly, and his distrust of law enforcement, stemming from a prior conviction for prescription drug abuse, had initially kept him from reporting what he saw. "I knew no one would believe me," he explained. "A disabled ex-con with a pain pill problem, but I couldn't just let them get away with it. So I started leaving the notes. I figured if I could lead you directly to the evidence, you'd have to act." Further investigation confirmed parts of Gaines's story. His detailed logs included license plate numbers of vehicles that were later connected to various crimes. In one notebook, he had recorded the description of a distinctive pickup truck seen near where Melissa Rankin's body was found, a vehicle that matched one owned by her ex-boyfriend, who subsequently became the primary suspect in her murder. But the case took an unexpected turn when forensic evidence linked Gaines himself to 2 of the crime scenes. His fingerprints were found on a fence post near where Jeremy Foster's body had been discovered, and fibers matching his distinctive jacket were recovered from the abandoned car where the first note had been left. When confronted with this evidence, Gaines's calm demeanor finally cracked. "Sometimes watching wasn't enough," he admitted. "Sometimes I needed to get closer to make sure I had the details right. I never touched the bodies, never interfered with the scenes. I just observed." Psychiatric evaluation revealed a man whose trauma and isolation had transformed him into something neither wholly predator nor protector. Gaines had become a peculiar type of voyeur of violence, not participating in the crimes themselves, but deriving a sense of power and purpose from his knowledge of them. His notes were not merely attempts to bring killers to justice, but also demonstrations of his own importance as the self-appointed watchman of the highways. "The most disturbing aspect of this case," Sheriff Keene later wrote in her final report, "is not just that Gaines witnessed these crimes without immediately reporting them, but that his surveillance likely spans many more cases than those he chose to reveal. His selection process, which murders to expose and which to keep in his private records, suggests a man who came to see himself as an arbiter, deciding which victims deserved justice and which killers deserved exposure." Gaines was eventually charged with obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and being an accessory after the fact in multiple homicides. His information, however, led to the resolution of 7 previously unsolved murders, including the arrest of Melissa Rankin's ex-boyfriend and the identification of a long-haul trucker responsible for a string of killings along the Interstate 75 corridor. For Sheriff Keene, the case represented a troubling gray area in criminal psychology. Gaines wasn't a killer, but neither was he simply a concerned citizen. He had created a strange niche for himself in the ecosystem of violence, the silent observer who derived meaning and purpose from the crimes of others, while maintaining just enough distance to preserve his self-image, as separate from the killers he watched. "The highways are lonely places," Gaines told Sheriff Keene during their final interview before his sentencing. "Most people just drive through, never noticing what happens in the margins. But I saw everything. I was the only one watching, Doesn't that count for something? The case prompted Sheriff Keene to establish a dedicated highway crime task force for Dalton County, focusing on the transient nature of such offenses and the vulnerable spaces created by America's vast road network. Her department installed additional cameras at strategic points along major routes and increased patrols of isolated rest areas and overlooks. But the most lasting impact of the Gaines case was psychological. For residents of Dalton County, the highways were no longer simply routes between destinations, but spaces where unnoticed observers might be watching from the tree line or a parked car, some with the worst intentions, others with motives more ambiguous, but no less disturbing. We tend to think of predators as active participants, Sheriff Keene explained during a law enforcement conference where she presented the case. But Gaines represents something different. The passive observer who derives satisfaction not from committing violence, but from knowing about it, controlling information about it, and revealing it on his own terms. In some ways, that's a more insidious presence because it exists in a blind spot in how we conceptualize criminal behavior. The map found in Gaines's makeshift rest stop headquarters was preserved as evidence, its dozens of colored pins representing not just the crimes he had reported, but the many more he had witnessed and kept to himself, a silent catalog of highway violence that had occurred just beyond the notice of the thousands who traveled those roads daily. For Sheriff Keene, who had built her career on finding connections others missed, the Gaines case served as a sobering reminder that sometimes the most dangerous connections are those formed not between crimes or victims, but between the observer and the observed, the watcher who, from a distance, inserts himself into others' tragedies, collecting their stories like souvenirs from a journey he can no longer take himself. Today, travelers passing through Dalton County might notice the increased police presence along Highway 27 and the new cameras monitoring its desolate stretches. What they don't see are the unmarked locations, the overgrown gulches, abandoned barns, and forgotten rest stops, where violence once occurred under the watchful eye of a man who had appointed himself the highway's messenger, deciding which secrets to keep and which to reveal, one white envelope at a time. Sheriff Roy Harlow had spent his entire 30-year career in Whitman County, Washington, a place where apple and cherry orchards stretched across rolling hills as far as the eye could see. The agricultural community was tight-knit, with most residents connected through generations of family farms. When a crime occurred, Sheriff Harlow usually knew both victim and perpetrator before the investigation began. That familiar pattern was shattered in the fall of 2010 when seasonal workers began disappearing from the county's orchards. The first to vanish was Miguel Suarez, a 28-year-old migrant worker from California who had been picking apples at Whitman orchards for 6 consecutive seasons. He was reported missing by his crew leader after failing to show up for work 3 days in a row, something completely out of character for a man known for his reliability. His few possessions remained in the shared housing provided by the orchard, but his truck was gone. Probably just moved on to another farm, suggested Deputy Miller during the initial briefing. These guys follow the harvest. Maybe he found better pay somewhere else. Sheriff Harlow might have accepted this explanation, if not for the truck. 2 days after Suarez was reported missing, state police found his vehicle abandoned at a rest stop 20 miles outside town. The keys were still in the ignition. There was no sign of a struggle, but Harlow's instincts told him something wasn't right. Before the investigation into Suarez's disappearance gained traction, 2 more workers vanished. Ana Cortez, 34, from Riverside Orchard, and Daniel Fuentes, 26, from Evergreen Farms. Like Suarez, both disappeared during the night, leaving their belongings behind. Neither owned vehicles. 3 workers from 3 different orchards in less than 2 weeks, Sheriff Harlow noted during a meeting with county officials. This isn't coincidence. The pattern continued. By the end of October, 7 workers had vanished without a trace. All were migrant laborers who lived in orchard-provided housing. All disappeared at night. None had any known enemies in the area. Sheriff Harlow faced mounting pressure from orchard owners concerned about labor shortages during peak harvest season, and from advocacy groups demanding protection for vulnerable workers. The investigation was complicated by the transient nature of seasonal labor. Many workers used multiple names, lacked official documentation, or maintained minimal contact with family. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A 12-year-old boy named Tommy Wilson, whose family owned a small farm adjacent to Whitman Orchards, reported seeing strange lights moving through the orchard at night, and a truck he didn't recognize parked on a rarely used access road. Most significantly, he mentioned a man carrying what looked like sleeping people to the vehicle on 2 separate occasions. When interviewed by Sheriff Harlow, Tommy described seeing the man using a flashlight with a weird red light instead of normal white light. The boy had assumed the worker was ill and being helped by someone, but after hearing about the disappearances at school, he became concerned. The man was big, Tommy explained, really tall, and he wore a hood, even though it wasn't that cold. Sheriff Harlow organized nightly surveillance of all major orchards in the county, positioning deputies in concealed locations with night vision equipment. For 3 nights, they observed nothing unusual. On the 4th night, a deputy stationed at Riverside Orchard reported a figure moving between the worker housing and a truck parked on a maintenance road, exactly matching Tommy's description, including the red-filtered flashlight. The deputy called for backup, but was instructed to maintain surveillance rather than approach. Through binoculars, he observed the hooded figure enter one of the housing units and emerge minutes later, supporting what appeared to be a semi-conscious worker. By the time reinforcements arrived, the truck was gone, and another worker had vanished. Jose Mendoza, 31. A county-wide alert was issued for the vehicle, described as a dark-colored pickup with a camper shell. State police located it 2 hours later at a remote hunting cabin 30 miles from the nearest orchard. Sheriff Harlow and a tactical team surrounded the property at dawn. What they found inside the cabin would haunt Whitman County for years to come. Jose Mendoza was found alive but heavily sedated, bound to a chair in the main room. In a locked back bedroom, deputies discovered a makeshift operating area with surgical equipment, refrigeration units, and medical supplies. Most disturbing was a logbook meticulously documenting procedures performed on 6 individuals, corresponding to 6 of the 7 missing workers. The cabin's owner was identified as Dr. Lawrence Fleming, 58, a former transplant surgeon who had lost his medical license 5 years earlier, following allegations of ethical violations and patient harm. Fleming had apparently been living a double life, working as an equipment supplier to local orchards while using his access to identify and target isolated workers. The investigation revealed a horrific operation. Fleming had been harvesting organs from his victims, storing them temporarily in his makeshift facility before transporting them to unknown recipients. The red-filtered flashlight was used to preserve his night vision, while allowing him to move through the orchards undetected. He used his knowledge of medical sedatives to render his victims unconscious before transporting them to the cabin. Jose Mendoza had been spared only because Fleming's last client had canceled, according to entries in the logbook. The other victims had not survived Fleming's procedures. When authorities drained a well behind the cabin, they recovered human remains consistent with post-organ harvesting disposal. He selected victims who were isolated, whose disappearances might be attributed to the transient nature of seasonal work, Sheriff Harlow explained during a press conference. People with minimal documentation, limited local connections, and families who might be hesitant to contact authorities. Fleming was arrested while attempting to cross the Canadian border. In his vehicle, investigators found a cooler containing harvested organs and documentation suggesting connections to an international black market organ trafficking network. He had been using his former medical credentials and connections to arrange private sales to wealthy recipients desperate enough to circumvent legal transplant waiting lists. What made the case particularly disturbing was Fleming's apparent lack of remorse. During interrogation, he referred to his victims solely by their blood types and organ quality, never acknowledging them as human beings. When Sheriff Harlow asked how he could justify murdering innocent people, Fleming responded with clinical detachment. "Supply and demand," he said. "These people were invisible to society already. I simply repurposed what would otherwise be wasted potential. One healthy migrant worker can save 5 lives through proper organ distribution." The FBI joined the investigation, using Fleming's records to identify 3 recipients of his illegally harvested organs. All claimed to have dealt with intermediaries and denied knowledge of the organ's origins. 2 of the recipients were prominent businessmen. The third was a former state politician. All faced charges related to the illegal organ trade. For Sheriff Harlow, the most disturbing aspect of the case wasn't just Fleming's brutality, but how effectively he had exploited societal blind spots. The doctor had correctly calculated that seasonal agricultural workers, many undocumented, all economically vulnerable, would not be prioritized if they disappeared. He had weaponized both their isolation and the community's tendency to view them as interchangeable labor rather than individuals with lives and families. Fleming didn't choose his victims randomly, Sheriff Harlow noted in his final report. He chose them precisely because society had already placed them at the margins. People whose disappearances would be explained away, whose absences might not even be reported. He didn't just exploit their physical vulnerability, but their social invisibility. The case transformed how Whitman County approached worker safety. Orchard owners implemented buddy systems, improved security around housing, and established formal check-in procedures for all employees. Sheriff Harlow's department created a specialized unit focused on crimes against agricultural workers, with Spanish-speaking deputies assigned to regular outreach. Yet the psychological impact on the community proved harder to address. For the remaining seasonal workers, the orchards, once simply places of hard but honest work, had become landscapes of potential danger. For local residents, the case shattered their perception of rural safety and exposed uncomfortable truths about whom they considered fully part of their community. Jose Mendoza, the only surviving victim, suffered lasting psychological trauma from his ordeal. With assistance from advocacy groups, he successfully applied for a special visa for crime victims and eventually testified at Fleming's trial, putting a human face to the suffering Fleming had caused. His testimony was instrumental in securing a conviction, resulting in multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Sheriff Harlow postponed his planned retirement to oversee the implementation of new safety protocols and community outreach programs. The experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of his role as a rural sheriff. "For 30 years, I thought I knew this county and everyone in it," he explained in an interview years later. "Fleming showed me that I was only seeing part of the picture. There were vulnerable people right in front of me, people I was responsible for protecting, who remained invisible until they started disappearing." The Fleming case became a case study taught in law enforcement academies across the country, highlighting how human trafficking and exploitation can hide in plain sight, even in seemingly close-knit rural communities. It demonstrated how certain populations remain particularly vulnerable to predators who understand and exploit their marginalized status. Today, a memorial stands at the edge of Whitman orchards, bearing the names of Fleming's victims and a pledge in both English and Spanish. Never again will any worker be invisible in Whitman County. The Sheriff's Department maintains a special telephone hotline staffed year-round by Spanish-speaking deputies, ensuring that seasonal workers always have a direct line to help. Sheriff Harlow eventually retired in 2015, but his legacy continues in the protocols established following the Fleming case. His successor expanded the initiatives to neighboring counties, creating a regional safety network for agricultural workers that has been recognized nationally as a model program. For residents of Whitman County, the orchards eventually reclaimed their place as symbols of agricultural bounty rather than sites of horror. But for Sheriff Harlow, the case remains a sobering reminder that the most dangerous predators aren't always those who hide in shadows, but sometimes those who operate in broad daylight, counting on society's blind spots to shield their activities from scrutiny. Fleming wasn't just a murderer, Sheriff Harlow reflected during a law enforcement conference where he presented the case. He was a stress test for our community, exposing exactly who we valued enough to protect and who we had relegated to the periphery of our concern. The true horror wasn't just what he did, but how long he was able to do it before anyone noticed people were missing.